Hey, hello and welcome to this video. So I just made a video going through fixing some issues with cubes that mostly look like they should work, but there are issues with each of them that need resolving. And I tend to make these videos just off the top of my head because I work in Blender all the time and making 3D models all the time. So I tend to know what kind of issues are going to come up. But one of the things that happens when you're working with models all the time is hopefully you find ways to do things faster. And so this is going to be about kind of increasing the speed of resolving issues, because the way that I did it in the previous video, because it was my first attempt at doing those fixing those errors in a long time. A lot of those errors don't appear for me that often at this point, and there's definitely been times where this stuff has happened, but it's not as frequent anymore, so my solutions to fixing it aren't as fast as they are when I've actually put more thought into it. So that's just my mindset and explainer for this video. Basically, knowing all the tools that are available to you, or just assuming there's a faster way of doing something, is how I remember to do this stuff. Because basically, I mean, there's some obvious issues with this cube. I've actually given it like all the issues that we went through. But I've done them in slightly different ways so that we're going to see some problems pop up in ways that I didn't quite explain in the other video. So just the same as last time, I'm going to apply the weighted normal, and we can see that that's highlighted this error in terms of shading, which, as we talked about, is a sign of interior faces. But not only that, you can see that I've got these sort of edges along the edge floating, and there's actually some vertices floating in there. So I've accidentally deleted not enough of the mesh at some point, or however you end up in this scenario, you've ended up with geometry that isn't connected to a face. And the major one there is actually I've got one that in edit mode is going to be very hard to spot when looking at this model, but in object mode, because it's just an edge on its own, we can actually see it overlaid on the model, which is a good sign that you've got a duplicated edge that isn't actually connected to a face. So yeah, just resolving those issues, I remembered faster ways of doing everything. The last way that I'm going to fix it is not great, so it's not going to work all the time, but it's worth knowing and thinking about things in the same way. So yeah, let's go through it. If I press, so because these vertices aren't selected, connected to a face, sorry, they actually count as loose geometry. So I'm in vertex mode right now, and if I select all by trait and loose geometry, those vertices that are on their own are going to now be selected. So I'm going to delete them. If I go to edge mode and I do the same thing, it's going to select all those edges that don't have a face connected. And finally, if I do the same thing, but I select interior faces, then we're going to realize that, oh, I've got an interior face here, and I don't quite know what the limitations on how Blender senses that that's an interior face. I don't know what those limitations are, but you can see in this example that it's worked. So I can just delete that. I'm not saying it's going to work all the time. And then the other one was that I was trying to set flow on these edges, and I've ended up with a scenario where potentially I'd have to go through and click all these by hand, which on this mesh isn't a big issue, but on another mesh might be. So I've suggested some things like select by length, but select by length in this case isn't working for me. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to select, and the reason it isn't working is because they're all the same length, obviously, and that's how this tool works. So if I actually select them by polygon sides on these triangles, and I'm going to temporarily break the mesh. I can bring this back later. I think if I limited dissolve this to get rid of that interior triangle, leaving these edges isolated. And then if I triangulate that later on, it's going to bring back that shape. So we're not losing anything by doing this. But what we're gaining by separating that, by deleting that, is now these edges have a different aspect to them, which we can try and select with this. Now, I'm not amazing at it because some of these haven't made sense for me, for a long time. Direction is going to be the direction of the edges, so selecting all those that are pointing in the same direction with the normal of the edge. Amount of faces around the edge. In this case, it's selected everything because it's got 4 faces around it, and I think it counts it from the way that it's counting it just happens to include every edge. So I'll maybe explain that again in a minute if we get to it. But if I do face angles, because actually, again, specifically in this example, it's the only edge that is flat to the surface, it's actually selected all those edges immediately for me. So that's a situation that I've artificially created, and I took some guesswork to get there. So now if I go set flow, I've done it to all of them, and yeah, now we can take advantage of Shift-G, polygon sides, and it's going to select all of those because the amount of sides it's an n-gon, and it's unique to this mesh, this face, these faces. So that's why that works. And it's, if you've got more things going on around here, like if I select Shift-G, amount of faces around the edge, sorry, that's the wrong one. Shift-G, face angles, because both of these are flat, they're both being selected. So if I had other flat geometry earlier, it would have selected more. And that's kind of like how that is. But the point is, I've definitely, in the past, taken some faces, removed some of that geometry temporarily because I know I can get it back much easier, and then used the select by trait, select by similar to allow me to, select the edges just as I did, something that's turned it into a unique scenario rather than something that's all over the mesh, and that's allowed me to do this a lot quicker. And the final one is that I suggested applying the scale, but as you see, as I just did that, and this is one that gets everyone out when they export to game engines, you realize it's coming in at the wrong scale, and then you apply scale. But because my scale initially, as you can see on the right, was negative, it's actually going to flip the normals. So you're going to have to flip the normals back. And I think that is pretty much everything that I could think of that's going to either catch you out from the last video or improve the speed of your workflow in relation to these errors.